Hello, Emma. Welcome. Thank you very much for applying to Oxford and for coming for an interview today. It's really good to meet you. We've enjoyed reading your personal statement and your submitted essays, and we'll talk a bit about that. The interview is going to be in three sections. We're going to start by looking at a piece of your submitted work, and then we'll look at a primary source passage, which you've had a chance to look at, and then finally we'll turn to your UCAS statement. But I'll hand over to my colleague Sian to begin with, if I may, to talk you through the essay.
Great. Yeah, so thank you for submitting the essay, which I found really interesting to read. And you were responding to the statement. Eisenhower's New Look strategy marked a fundamental shift in US Cold War policy away from Truman's approach, assessed the validity of this view. And you made a really interesting argument for continuity. Can you just tell me, summarize for me, why you think continuity was so important in explaining these policies?
Yeah, of course. I think at the time, the kind of argument that I was making was that more than kind of being any sort of physical enactment of policy, it felt that the New Look policy was more of a superficial new look at the way that the Cold War was being fought. And I think I would go even further kind of now and slightly revise the argument that I made and try to kind of distinguish the New Look strategy into, I guess, doctrine and then policy. And I think you can kind of argue that in terms of policy, the continuation was really, really drastic. And I think that is highlighted by the fact that, yes, there is an argument that the New Look kind of doctrine, if we see that Eisenhower's policy more as a doctrine, did have some significant kind of changes. I think it highlights that it was more of a psychological change and way of looking at the Cold War rather than any change in practice, which I think is highlighted by just the events that took place while he was president.
So that distinction between doctrine and policy is really interesting. If we think first of all about the doctrine, and you said you think there might have been a change in the sort of psychology of it. Tell me a bit more about that. What are you thinking there?
Yeah, so I think if we look back to kind of when Truman became president and at the kind of very origins of the Cold War, we were already beginning to see a fundamental shift. I would argue for Truman, there was a fundamental shift from kind of previous policy and turning away from the isolationist kind of foreign policy of the US into kind of, I guess, getting involved now with this global state of affairs, I think. Whereas when when the kind of backlash from that came, I think there was perhaps quite a bit of criticism about the US, I guess, becoming more involved in this wider conflict. So I think the, I guess, change of mindset for Eisenhower was perhaps to reassure, I think, his people in the US that this wasn't such a kind of a drastic shift, a damaging shift for US foreign policy as it may have seemed. I think particularly the kind of, I guess, the shift to alliances and relying on others made it seem as though this was a fight that wasn't just being fought by the US and it wasn't kind of them against the world. So whereas in practice, I guess there was very little kind of rollback of communism. I mean, it's one of the things I talk about a lot. He kind of states that he will be fighting against this hostile ideological force, whereas in practice there's no proxy wars in the period. There is a failure to intervene in places like Hungary. So yeah, I would argue it's more superficial than in practice, I think.
So when we see the shift in the sort of the veneer of that's placed on these policies, do you think we explain that through popular pressure? So do you think that that's because he thinks that will be something that's more palatable and more appealing to the electorate? Or do you think we explain from a top-down perspective that actually it's about him as an individual?
Yeah, I suppose it's arguable that there's a mixture of both, and I suppose you have to kind of assess which one is perhaps more pertinent in defining the policy. I think absolutely, as a president, you were always kind of considering the electorate and what is going to make you seem more favourable. And I think particularly after the Korean War, kind of just having finished, when Eisenhower comes into the presidency, there does seem to be a sense that perhaps the US aren't doing quite as well as they should be doing in this fight against communism. And I think there was definitely a sense that in order to kind of placate the fears of the Red Scare, McCarthyism, there was a sense of Eisenhower, I guess, trying to implement these new ideas to the public. But then I think also it is kind of top down in a sense that I think perhaps also from the wider world, in a global setting, I think Eisenhower probably felt quite a growing pressure, I guess, to also appear as a strong beacon of capitalism, anti-communism, and I think hence I think that could also explain the growth of alliance systems and this I suppose need to appear as a stronger power.
That's a really interesting point. So we can't just explain US politics by looking within the US, so we need to place it in this global context of changing policies much more broadly in Europe and Asia, right across the world. That's really interesting. You used the word fears then. You talked about the fears of the people, and you write about that in the essay as well. Tell me a bit more about that. As historians, how would we study fear in that way? How would we know that that was the way people felt?
Yeah, I think fear and kind of all emotions, more human emotions, it's hard to measure as a historian looking back, because you really have to kind of situate yourself as an individual who was involved in these wider systems. And I think sometimes it's very easy to look at kind of Eisenhower and what he did, but perhaps if we think about ourselves as being one of the many American public, you have to kind of think how they were receiving this message. And I think the kind of things that they would be hearing about was the McCarthyism kind of campaign. I think that was something that was being reported. I think a lot of what they were hearing would be through the media. And I think the media would definitely be highlighting and picking on things that would, I guess, strengthen the case for this Red Scare, because in doing so, I think that would act on as a pressure on the government to, I guess, take a hardline stance against it. So I think the fear was probably perhaps even greater than was necessarily kind of justified at that point, just because of the way that information was being concentrated and delivered to them.
That's really interesting. So we've now got a central role played by the media in creating this sort of veneer of a change because of the significance of fear. What sources might we use as historians to understand how people responded to the media? So if we wanted to know what was a factory worker or a housewife thinking when they watch things or listen to things on the radio, what sources might we use to find that out?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's first you have to kind of consider how easy it is to get hold of these sources and whether they even exist. But I think at the kind of most simple level, if we could get hold of things like letters, diary entries, I mean, that kind of thing would be, I think, the most useful in terms of gauging people's individual fears, because I feel in that kind of intimate types of writing, maybe people will be most likely to, I guess, you think, kind of talk about their most, I guess, raw feelings about this kind of thing. I think in the official documents, which perhaps we place too much emphasis on when studying things like this, normally the official documents, I guess the perimeter strategy speeches and Eisenhower's own kind of writings, there's definitely, of course, more of a sense that those were being held accountable. And I think it's harder to gain a sense of individual feeling, and certainly the fears of the general populace, I think, are definitely harder to gauge from that.
That's fascinating. Thank you. So that's the end of this bit of the interview talking about your essay, but maybe with that focus on letters, we might move sideways into thinking about the source you've just been looking at.
Yeah, of course.
That was a really interesting conversation to listen to. One of the joys of interviewing is hearing conversations about topics that you're not terribly familiar with. I work on medieval things most of the time, so it's wonderful to hear a discussion about the Cold War. But you picked up rightly on letters as being an interesting potential source for all kinds of historical periods. And the letter you've just read and had about half an hour to read was written by a 23-year-old born in England, but who moved to Australia, to Melbourne, and she's writing to her uncle in 1851. And you've had a few minutes to look at this. Again, I should stress I know nothing about this period myself, and so some of my questions will be from genuine ignorance. But I want to just start with your general impressions. What did you make of the passage?
Yeah, I suppose taking the passage rather as a whole, and kind of, I guess, drawing on this this topic of letter writing that we were just kind of talking about, I think it says a lot that this kind of 23-year-old woman from England is not only writing a letter, but the kind of tone of the letter, the way that she writes, some of the kind of phrases that she used seem to suggest to me that she is a kind of very learned, very eloquent woman. And I think particularly kind of the second footnote refers to a passage from the book, the Gospel, I think it was talking about. So there's definitely a sense that she has some form of quite high education, and that was something which I suppose if we were to kind of look at the wider context of this, you'd have a lot of questions about what kind of education she had, what kind of standing that had put her in society. And then I guess leading on from that, why it was then a logical move for her to come to Australia when she had such an education. I suppose you might expect that there would be a place for her in English society with such an education. So definitely that was something that struck me.
You've deduced a lot about Rebecca from this one page of text already. That's really impressive. I'd like to sort of probe a little bit on what we'll come back to Rebecca and how what the passage reveals about her and her sense of identity. But I'd like to begin by asking you what you picked up about the nature of the economy in Australia that the passage reveals.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we can kind of gather from this is that the addressee of the letter, Rebecca's uncle, didn't look favourably upon the kind of move that Rebecca and her family have made, perhaps because of what one would suggest maybe a negative perception of the situation and the Australian economy in England. I mean, Rebecca says, now what do you think of our emigrating to this gold region, suggesting perhaps there was initial thoughts that maybe it wasn't the best idea. And I think, but then it's funny that she kind of defends the move, but then goes on to say that it is just a matter of chance, kind of actually achieving a good level of wealth in this economy. I think absolutely, she says there has been quite an uproar and there has been this boom, but she talks about only kind of in the account that she read, only one man found kind of such a sizable piece of gold, and the rest did not find any at all. So I think, and then she refers to her mother, who is having, I loved the phrase, cut her coat according to her cloth. So definitely she acknowledges kind of her own financial limitations and suggests that it was kind of a great risk, I think, putting all your eggs in kind of this basket and going over to Australia in the hopes of kind of gaining wealth, which was by no means assured.
That's really interesting, and you've pulled an awful lot out there. Yes, I mean the letter she does seem to be very keen to persuade her uncle that this is a good thing and there are exciting possibilities. In the end, she's trying to persuade him to come to Australia. But in doing so, yes, she draws out something of the atmosphere of Australia during the gold rush, the risks involved, the amount that's put to chance. Is there a sense that the gold rush has destabilised the economy of Melbourne and Victoria?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when she talks about kind of not being able to see any men or boys around the town, even the gents at the bank are off to the digging, I think it does suggest that, I guess, manpower and focus has been pulled away from kind of every other part of the economy to focus on this, I guess, gold rush. And I suppose in practice that would definitely lead to, I guess, a skewing of the economy if all, I guess, resources were concentrated in one sector, you'd worry that if that sector did not work out, I suppose even if it did prove very profitable, you would be hugely lacking in other areas of society and the economy, which would, I think, prove very damaging in the long run. I would suggest. I don't know what the later context is.
Yeah, sure. You rightly said that the gold rush is drawing men into this activity, and I just wonder what we might deduce from the passage about women's role in the economy and how the gold rush has affected gender expectations in the period.
Yeah, so I think there's definitely a sense that in, I guess, day-to-day society, men are kind of lacking, and you wonder what that means for, I guess, women like Rebecca and her sisters she talks about, and even her mother, in terms of, I guess, forming a sense of family life. I think it would probably be a very different situation to the one that they had experienced in England, when I suppose there would be a lot more men kind of present in everyday society. I suppose, I don't know how far kind of considerations of marriage would have crossed Rebecca's mind, but I suppose it'd be very difficult to kind of pursue anything of that sort if all the men were kind of just not around. And I think you wonder whether maybe that kind of plays on ideas of her own independence. I mean, she talks about being half inclined to kind of go to the mines herself. And there is this sense that she kind of feels that she now needs to take on this role of being her own provider in some sense. And I don't know whether it was kind of her being a bit sarcastic when she talks about spoiling her beauty, but certainly there is that sense of, I guess, a dichotomy between more material considerations and then kind of her I guess, providing for her family, and then her beauty.
That's beautifully done, and it is a wonderful part of the letter where she's on the one hand saying, "Oh, I wish I was a man, I could go there. Maybe I'll try and go there, but I'm worried they'll rumble me and they'll see that I'm not a man." On the other hand, she's concerned about her curls and the impact on her good looks and so forth, and so it is affecting how she sees the world and her sense of identity. And on identity, I wonder if one of the themes of the letter is where she is now, and you know, does she identify with being an Australian or in Victoria? What do we learn about colonial identities, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, I thought it was remarkable that she's kind of only been there 2 years, I think it was, before writing this letter, and yet she refers to Australia as our splendid country. There's definitely a sense of that she's kind of adopted an Australian identity already, as opposed to an English one. And she even talks of the poor, faint-hearted English, quite, I guess, a bit superior in her tone, I think, as though she's not one of those anymore. So yeah, definitely the sense that she is now an Australian, and I think she talks about the beautiful land and the beautiful black soil, and there definitely seems to be a sense that she now aligns more with that identity than the English, which is also unusual, because she talks about the bushfires and the heat as quite new and alien things to her. Yet I think as a whole, she seems to have adopted life there as quite her own, even though it necessarily hasn't proved as kind of prosperous for her yet as someone who maybe had found the gold. So I suppose it wasn't necessarily just dependent on her being successful there. I think this was a life that she adopts just by kind of being there.
Yeah, that's terrific. And if you, very briefly to wrap up, if you wanted to pursue some of these themes further, let's say about women's experience, was it difficult for them to find partners? Did it profoundly shape women's roles in this period? Or let's say about the stabilizing effects of the economy, what might we look as historians to fill out the picture of the text we have in front of us?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be, this is one of the kind of instances where obviously we now have a letter. Perhaps it would be more useful to look at some more kind of official statistics, kind of go the other way in terms of looking at these wider documents and seeing how many women, I guess, were kind of migrating in this sense, what the kind of effects on the economy were, and I suppose different specific sectors of the economy. I mean, not just the gold, but kind of what the effect on, I guess, more more normal aspect of the economy in the kind of succeeding century, because I think this is something that could definitely have effects beyond just the kind of immediate.
Yeah, good. And on the, as it were, other side of the passage, which gives a little bit of introduction, there is some data there about the rapid increase in the population, you know, which confirms the sense in the letter that enormous numbers of people are being drawn to Australia. You know, the ships emptying out and the men going off to the diggings is confirmed by Melbourne's population increasing by, you know, pretty much 500,000 in the space of a few years, and that must come from official data somewhere. That's been terrific, really, really good. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand back over now to Sian to talk through aspects of your personal statement. Well done.
So one of the things that really interested me in your personal statement was your interest in literature and history together, and talking about the different contributions that each can make to our understanding of the past. And I wonder if you can tell me a little bit more about what you think literature brings to our understanding of the past.
I think one of the things that kind of you sometimes don't always necessarily consider when studying history without the kind of literary aspect of it is more of the kind of individual voices. And I think one of the things that I talk about in my personal statement is the kind of memorial that didn't have any words. And I said that kind of didn't harm it. But I think now, kind of looking back on it, I think that it's something that while history isn't necessarily harmed by lack of words about it, I think it does, in a sense, kind of add to it, because I do think the way that we learn about history, of course, you have kind of more visual aspects of learning about it and architecture, but I think most of the way in which we digest history is through words, and I think not all of that needs to be kind of the more narrative sort of history. I think you can kind of learn a lot from the ways in which people wrote more, I suppose, literary novels, poems, and because I don't think you can write without being influenced by the events that are going on around you. And I think sometimes that writing is very conscious, and there is a sense of shaping the present as you want it to be remembered. But I think that it's always possible to also gain some sense of the kind of unconscious influences on a writer, which of course we would call history, I suppose.
That's an interesting point. So if we go back to the text you were just looking at, so we're thinking about mid-19th century Australia. If we had a novel that was written from that time, what would that bring to our understanding alongside the letter and the statistics that you were talking about?
I think it would give a sense of what kinds of things people want to be reading about, perhaps, is one of the things we could, I suppose, not to kind of dangerously say, because of course a novel could be about anything, but perhaps I suppose one of the main things we need to consider is that novels were perhaps written in view of the reader at the time. So I think it gives a sense of what the demand for reading was at the time. I think you can kind of look at this history of reading and see at what points in history different people wanted to hear about. I mean, it would be interesting to see whether that novel was something that kind of tried to capture a realist sense of this gold rush, or whether it was something perhaps more fantastical, which tried to, I guess, escape that situation. And then from that, you could kind of, I suppose, of course, this is a generalization as well, but try and gain a sense of how content people were with their situation, whether there was a sense of needing to escape, or whether they were quite family rooted in their own real, I suppose.
So in that sense, something that was really fantastical and escapist could tell us as much as something that was trying to be very factually accurate and realist in the way in which it represented Australia in that period.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you raise the issue of memorialization there, like which bits of our history do we make public and make part of our identities? When you think about this story of emigration from England to Australia, do you think that's become something which we have memorialized, which is part of the histories that we write today?
Yeah, I think so, and I think you can even see that in Rebecca's letters, the kind of things that she chooses to, I guess, focus on. I mean, we were talking about this sense of colonial identity. I mean, it's more about a sense of what was gained rather than kind of what was left behind. I think when she adopts this identity of her new splendid country, it's definitely a sense that I think people try to kind of focus on what they felt was most pertinent in their identity, and I think that's something that comes across quite strongly here. And I suppose the letter itself has now become, I guess, an act of memorialization. I don't think memorialization has to be necessarily something that you do intentionally or consciously. I think every time you write, you are in effect memorializing some part of history.
That's interesting. So you write in your personal statement about a visit to a concentration camp and thinking about that in a very sort of spatial sense of memorialization through a monument or through a particular environment. And now you're saying actually it's also about much smaller things than that as well. How do they work differently, do you think?
Yeah, so I think one of the kind of things that was particularly striking about the concentration camp, and I suppose all kinds of physical monuments and memorials, is the way that they kind of reshape space and turn that into something that is kind of now, I guess, inscribed with the history that has been enacted around it. But I think that's also, I suppose, testament to the power of words in some sense. When you have kind of memorials that have words, it is the words, I think, that kind of act upon the space. And I think it doesn't just have to be on a page or on a screen that the words can act in that sense. It is, I think, testament to the power that words have to, I think, reshape the way that we kind of see everything.
That's fascinating. Thank you. I would love to keep talking about it with you, but I think we're coming towards the end of the interview now.
Likewise, that was a tremendously interesting half an hour. Thank you so much again for your application, for coming to interview. We really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you.